Two distinguished guests join me on the broadcast to share their perspective. I'm pleased to welcome in the studio Professor Swaran Singh, Center for International Politics, Organization and Disarmament School of International Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University. Professor, thank you for your time. Welcome to the program. The Prime Minister's visit to Russia, Professor, from the perspective of both the bilateral engagements that he had and also his participation in the BRICS summit has been quite significant. We'll talk about the BRICS engagement first. In line with India's policy of multilateralism, trying to seek greater voice and greater participation of the countries of the global south, how important has the 16th BRICS summit been?
Thank you. I think India has been a votary of multilateralism from the very beginning, and it appears that BRICS on international stage is the most thriving multilateral arrangement that we see. This is particularly seen from the number of aspirant nations. So in the last summit meeting in Johannesburg, President Ramaphosa had said 43 nations had expressed intention to join and 19 had formally applied, out of which certain countries were offered membership. This time in Kazan, again 34 nations had expressed a desire to join, particularly some of the very interesting names like Turkey, which is a NATO member. Is willing to join BRICS nations. Even among ASEAN nations, which is supposed to be close to Western nations, countries like Thailand, Malaysia are thinking to join BRICS nations. So the most exciting multilateral grouping, as I call it, it's not an organization, in which India is seen as a very central player, partly because of the whole rising stature of India in terms of going to be third largest economy, the personal aura of Indian Prime Minister and his style of building personal relationships. And in that sense, particularly the fact that they were able to build consensus on bringing in 13 new partners, because that excitement has to stay on. Otherwise, we were talking of the pause put on membership in the last foreign ministers meeting of BRICS nations. There was a little uncertainty what happens to aspirant nations. So they found a formula to get new nations on board. They've been particularly emphatic on issues of global south being represented in global governance. On climate change, for example, they've been very emphatic on climate finance. I think it's also interesting that the meeting took place just before the G20 summit being represented in global governance. On climate change, for example, they've been very emphatic on climate in the last foreign ministers meeting of BRICS nations partners. Because that excitement has to stay on. Otherwise, we were talking of the pause put on membership in the last foreign ministers meeting of BRICS nations. There was a little uncertainty what happens to aspirant nations. So they found a formula to get new nations on board. They've been particularly emphatic on issues of global south being represented in global governance. On climate change, for example, they've been very emphatic on climate finance. I think it's also interesting that the meeting took place just before the G20 summit is going to happen. So some of these issues are going to be also pressed upon in G20 meeting, which is where BRICS always sits as a mini summit within the G20 summit meeting. Very quickly for India, there are multiple levels of looking at what India was doing in terms of bilateral relationships. The meeting with the Iranian president was interesting because he just taken over.
Sure, we'll come to that aspect, Professor. So in that context, Professor, because it benefits both, it sort of solidifies India's position that we took at G20, giving a voice to the global south. And now we've seen an expansive agenda which is going to benefit countries of the global south. But also the fact that do you now see this evolution, the expansion of BRICS from a geo-economic framework to a more geopolitical one in the current geopolitical scenario? And what are going to be some of the geopolitical implications also of this expansive group?
And that's true that as it has expanded and has become more attractive, it's no longer simply confining agenda to only pure monetary and financial issues.
Absolutely.
It does step out and talk about other major concerns that the stakeholders, the members, partners and aspirants have in terms of what they think BRICS should be delivering. So fundamental point that brings all of these nations together is their shared understanding that the Bretton Woods institutions of post-World War II are no longer representative of the reality that we live in today.
Okay.
And perhaps there is need for recasting those organizations so that the current really major players are represented in those. For instance, IMF is always headed by a European, and World Bank is always headed by an American citizen. Whereas the world has moved in a very different direction, whereas Ambassador just mentioned, BRICS collective GDP is far larger today than G7 countries collectively. And of course, in population terms, they are really much larger compared to G7, which continues to largely control global governance from that perspective. So therefore, I think the BRICS nations are bringing a whole new way of thinking, and that is why, you know, it's a statement, as you quoted the foreign minister saying. So the kind of more equitable and more inclusive approach that BRICS is taking is what makes BRICS also increasingly effective. And for example, they are, you know, about 40% of global oil exports are now within BRICS. Number one and number two importers, largest importers of oil, are within BRICS. And therefore, you know, China is now world's largest donor from 2017. India is world's largest, fastest growing economy and going to be third largest economy. So a lot of momentum here is what is bringing them together. But yes, your question is they are moving into political geopolitics as well. And that is particularly driven by the paranoia that we notice in Western world about what BRICS is going to do. They look at their efforts to use increasingly local currencies. They interpret it in terms of de-dollarization. It's not an attempt to finish dollar as a
finding
currency.
alternate means.
It's finding alternatives. Euro was another effort made earlier. So in that sense, the paranoia that West sees from BRICS makes every statement of BRICS, you know, being seen from prism of geopolitics, and that would perhaps make consensus increasingly difficult. As now members moved from 5 to 9, there are a lot of other, you know,
in waiting
in the waiting now. So as the grouping expands, this externally driven geopolitical perceptions of members perhaps will make the consensus increasingly a challenging task for the next host. Brazil, for example, this will be an increasing challenge, how to ensure that consensus. But the fact that they stood together, they've issued a great statement, is important for the G20 meeting now, which is where Global South is being connected by India's initiative last year. And interesting it is to see Russia, China, India, all of us see as important members, in fact, leaders of Global South. And the body language in Kazan was very interesting of these three leaders to see there is a certain increasing bonhomie, if not camaraderie, which should see them also coordinating their strategies as to how they wish to bring Global South to the center stage of global decision making.
But that question, Professor, leads me also to the challenges that you rightly pointed out in the earlier remark was, when you don't have a defined charter or a secretariat or no common funds as well, but you have an expanded outreach, expanded agenda as mentioned in the Kazan Declaration, do you think when the bloc will largely rely on consensus-based decision-making, and which is very informal, that is also a very big challenge in the times to come, because you have countries that that also are dealing with lots of internal conflicts, and the two big large economies being India and China?
That's absolutely right, Tina. Let me begin by saying that organizations with a secretariat, with a strict membership, with a charter or constitution is a 20th century phenomenon. In 21st century, we are largely talking of groupings and networks. You must have heard Dr. Jaishankar often mentions of plurilateralism, which is basically emphasizing on fluidity and flexibility of groupings. And consensus is important, and consensus will have its own challenges to build. But if you notice various speeches made in Kazan, there is an effort also to make a distinction between the founding members who have just joined, and the partner nations. So I think that, you know, if not directly, that distinction will stay on also in terms of how consensus is built. So initially the consensus has to be built between the core members, and then of course others will join over a period of time. That distinction is beginning to be seen now within BRICS nations. So Russia, China, India would definitely be very, very critical to how BRICS moves forward in coming times. Now, as far as the challenges are concerned, I am more concerned with the expanding agenda that they have. And since they are expanding their agenda, so will the challenges will expand, because certainly, as you mentioned, there is no dedicated source of funding as of now available to push forward some of these initiatives. But at the same time, these are all in their own way rapidly growing economies. So their economic heft is going to constantly increase over a period of time. Growth rates, even in smaller economies of BRICS today, are relatively impressive compared to growth rates in advanced countries, which is where United States for a long time was stuck on about 1.8%, now moving beyond 2 and reaching almost 3%. So in that sense, the confidence of these BRICS nations would perhaps help them to constantly move forward in dealing with the challenges that they've laid for themselves. Major issues they are talking is of reforming international institutions. And that is no longer being said in terms of myopic self-interest of what India will get, what China will get, what Russia will get. I think it's a larger motive of making these institutions more representative of the world we live in, and therefore making them more effective. We have seen United Nations, almost dysfunctional in case of both conflict in West Asia and conflict in Ukraine and Russia. So in that sense, the focus is, particularly India's focus is to make sure that we are not ignoring and undermining certain institutions that exist. That is why, again, Foreign Minister repeatedly says BRICS is non-Western but not anti-Western. And India stands for that we want to make sure that certain bridge building can be done between East and West, North and South. Institutions can be gradually, incrementally improvised instead of junking them away as irrelevant and creating parallel institutions. That is the fear that West has, that BRICS is beginning to appear as an alternative, which is how many countries of global South see it. So some of these disjunctions have to be smoothened, and an expanding agenda has to be really carried forward. Those are the challenges that BRICS today face, but I'm sure they are strategizing as to how they will deal with those challenges, constantly going through consensus building, which is where I personally notice as one person that perhaps now the founding members and additional members and partner nations, there is going to be certain calibration of how consensus has to move from the center to the periphery in that sense.
Absolutely. We'll hope in the times to come the declaration, the points that have been mentioned will translate into significant outcomes which will benefit India and the region at large. Professor, the fact that, India-China relations, and if they're on a stronger footing, they mutually benefit both countries and the region as well. This we've heard umpteen number of times from leaders of both sides, but on the ground, and especially after 2020, we've seen how relations hit a new low. The fact that the current thaw offers some hope in improvement in ties, but what would it require? On part of China particularly, we've seen it's one neighbor that can't be trusted. For lasting peace at the borders and for our relations to move further on a positive side, what will it take?
I think peace will be always work in the making. It's not that we can at any stage relax and say now things are done. But the fact that after a long wait of 4 years, now we have a message from the highest level, from the national leaders of both countries, saying that we want to now climb down from the tension point. So in that sense, it's a good signal. Of course, a lot of work remains to be done. Good side is that they have agreed on the patrolling and grazing arrangements, which often is the reason why tensions are built up. Yeah. But they have to now do other things like, drawing back their armed forces from advanced positions in the frontier, then move to de-escalation, then come back to peace and tranquility kind of mode that we have had before. Then at some stage start talking of resolving this world's longest disputed boundary between any two nations. Of course, these are also very powerful and rapidly transforming countries. So the confidence of armed forces and common citizens, the facilities on the frontiers are transforming as well, which make the mobility very easy. So you can bring in larger numbers with heavier equipment, quasi-permanent structures, much faster to the front, and that is going to be constantly adding on to the frequency and intensity of what we call aggressions, which we have to manage much better. So because they also have past, which is the question is, can we trust them? We also have future, where these expanding economies are also transacting business with each other, which is creating new challenges. If you don't have any trade, no irritants. But when you have huge amount of trade of $138 billion, 500,000 people traveling from one side to the other, then there are issues of visa, there are issues of all kinds of new issues for the future. And of course, they collectively want to work together to deal with many global and regional challenges, where even if their aim and objective is similar, their strategies are often at variance. So there are going to be a lot of challenges to still follow from here. But it's a great signal that two leaders are indicating that we want to now ensure that we return back to peace and tranquility and find a solution between us, that we want to work together and resolve issues that we have had, and actually complement each other's development trajectories in that sense. So it's a good signal, and potentially how we move forward from here can make it a really inflection point between the relations of China and India. But I think it's also a very quick point I want to make here, and I saw Ambassador making mention of domestic compulsions from Indian side. India has proven to be unique neighbor of China. China's strategy of 2 steps forward, 1 step backward has been very effective in South China Sea. ASEAN nations till date have not stood up to China despite their claims and counterclaims there. India stood up for 4.5 years on the border, and not only the 2 steps forward, 1 step backward failed, when China tried to improvise strategy and say, let us look at the staying power and who blinks first, India refused to blink. And therefore, I think that compelled China to move to peacemaking with India, and that's a great lesson for Chinese, and I think also lesson for India in that sense that India cannot be a country like any other.
Right.
In fact, let me also add, by the body language that I noticed, how Prime Minister Modi walked in and Xi Jinping looked like hosting that meeting of two leaders. It makes me feel that meeting was solicited by Chinese and not by Indian side.
Oh, so on that note, we'll have to wind up the program. That's an interesting takeaway. So we'll have to see how the India-China relations build up in future. For now, of course, the reality is that the talks at the diplomatic and the military level are going to continue for peace to prevail at the borders. It will be difficult for relations to get back to the level at which they were before the Galwan incident happened in 2020. But of course, in the better interest of both India and China, and as our leaders keep reiterating, for the two large economies to have better relations is something that is going to be mutually beneficial for the region as well, and for the larger global good as well. So we'll see how that relation transforms for the good in the times to come. But with that, I'll wrap up the conversation because time allows me to take up only that much on this edition of Perspective. Thank you, Professor and Ambassador, for joining us on this broadcast, sharing your thoughts with us and our viewers.